Committee will come to order. I would like to begin this hearing by stating the Oversight Committee mission statement. We exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. We will work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is the mission of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. I want to thank everybody for attending today, and particularly our witnesses that we are about to hear from. The title of the hearing is Protecting International Religious Freedom. I want to welcome Ranking Member Tierney and members of the subcommittee and those of you that are here in the audience. Religious freedom, often referred to as the first freedom, is a fundamental human right. It is enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution. It is a right essential to our human existence and one that all mankind deserves. It is also a well-established tenet of international law, including both the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, an international treaty ratified by 156 nations, including the United States of America. Religious freedom has long been neglected as part of the U.S. human rights agenda. Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act, creating new bureaucracies and policy tools to ensure religious freedom became a core objective of U.S. foreign policy. Now, regrettably, nearly 16 years after its passage, Congress's intent in passing the International Religious Freedom Act is being thwarted by mandates within the Act that are also being ignored. A few months after the hearing we held last June on this topic, the Ambassador-at-Large for International Religious Freedom at the State Department resigned. Unfortunately, that position has remained vacant for nearly a year. But just recently, the President nominated Rabbi David Saperstein to serve as the next Ambassador-at-Large for the International Religious Freedom. This is a step in the right direction. We hope that the United States Senate will confirm this person sooner rather than later. Once confirmed by the Senate, however, he must be given all the necessary tools and resources to succeed. A study released earlier this year by the Pew Research Center found that 76% of the world's population lives in countries with high or very high levels of restriction on religion. Even more troubling, the number of countries with a high or very high level of social hostilities involving religion reached a 6-year peak in 2012, with hostilities increasing in almost all major regions of the world, aside from the Americas. Just last month in Nigeria, Boko Haram militants overran a church compound and a rectory of the St. Denis Parish. Militants are now using the former church compound as a base. Shortly before these events, Boko Haram carried out a series of bombings in the home of the predominantly Christian community. Their gunmen used IEDs and petrol bombs to destroy 5 churches. Sadly, events such as these have become all too common. Never has the time been clearer for the need to strengthen America's religious freedom policy. I'm hard-pressed to name any countries where the United States' engagement on international religious freedom has made a measurable impact to lessen the persecution of religious minorities. Given U.S. national security interests in combating religious extremism and fostering stable democratic institutions, the importance of promoting religious freedom is clear. The Administration's pattern of marginalizing the international religious freedom must end. We can certainly do better. It is my hope that our discussions here today will highlight the areas where improvement is necessary, while offering recommendations as we move forward to ensure that international religious freedom is at the forefront of American foreign policy. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses, but we are now going to hear from the Ranking Member and a friend who is also celebrating his birthday today. So I know we all join in wishing him a happy, happy birthday and recognize the Ranking Member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your best wishes as well. It's the anniversary of my 39th birthday, which I continually have over and over and over again. So and as a gift to all of you, I'm going to waive the oral presentation on my remarks and ask unanimous consent to enter my remarks upon the record.
Thank the gentleman. All members will have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record, and we will now recognize our panel. Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett is the Chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom and President and CEO of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights. Dr. Thomas F. Farr is the Director of the Religious Freedom Project and the Program on Religion and U.S. Foreign Policy at Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Mr. Robert Smith is the Managing Director and Regional Advisor for the United States at the International Center for Law and Religious Studies at the J. Reuben Clark Law School at Brigham Young University. BYU happens to be my alma mater. Glad to have you here, sir. And Mr. Emmanuel Ogbe, did I pronounce that properly? He said close enough. My apologies. Is Special Counsel to the Justice for JOS Project at the Jubilee Campaign. We appreciate you being here. And Mr. Tad Stanky is the Vice President for Research and Analysis at Human Rights First. We thank you all for being here and appreciate it. And consistent with committee practices and rules, all witnesses will be sworn before they testify. So if you please rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, we would appreciate it if you would limit your verbal comments to 5 minutes. A fuller statement, additional comments, we'd be happy to enter those into the record. But now we'll recognize Dr. Lantos Swett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman Chaffetz. And of course, it's a pleasure to be with you as well, Congressman Tierney Moore, from my neck of the woods, New Hampshire, and someone who served with both my father and my husband in this body. So it's lovely to see you. And I do request that my written statement be submitted for the record. This hearing is very timely. Events since my June 2013 testimony before this subcommittee starkly make the point. If the U.S. doesn't get religious freedom right, we won't get U.S. foreign policy right. My written testimony reviews the International Religious Freedom Act, IRFA, over the past 15 years and USCIRF's role in its implementation and offers recommendations. My focus today is on events that underscore the connections between religious freedom, U.S. foreign policy, and U.S. and global security. ISIL's barbarism in Syria and Iraq is in the forefront of all of our minds. With its growing strength, occupation of broad swaths of land, brutal executions, and threats to bring its war to America and elsewhere, ISIL poses a chilling danger. But we should remember ISIL is not alone in perpetrating violence in these countries. USCIRF has highlighted the al-Assad regime's killing of tens of thousands and displacing of millions, while exacerbating sectarianism, resulting in severe religious freedom violations affecting all Syrians. And USCIRF long has identified the Iraqi government's failure to stem non-state actors' egregious and growing violence against civilians, which increased rather than reduced Sunni-Shia tensions. ISIL's recent extraordinary territorial gains in northern Iraq poses an existential threat, especially to religious minorities, including Christians, Yazidis, Shabak, Kakai, and Turkmen, and religious and ethnic minorities in Syria, including Christians and Alawites. Less well known and less well recognized is ISIL's brutality against both countries' Shia Muslims and dissenting Sunni Muslims. So what should the United States do? USCIRF has welcomed U.S. assistance to the displaced in northern Iraq, and we strongly support additional assistance to meet dire needs. We also support raising the refugee resettlement ceiling and increasing the share of refugees from the region for Iraqis and Syrians vulnerable to persecution, and expanding the existing priority categories that allow certain Iraqis direct access to the U.S. admissions program without UNHCR referral. While USCIRF cannot speak to the economic, political, and military aspects of any plan to confront ISIL, we encourage our government to weave into these plans the promotion of the freedom of religion and belief and protection of religious minorities. But the U.S. government needs to weave religious freedom more broadly into its plans before crises erupt. ISIL isn't the only non-state actor that persecutes. Just look at Boko Haram in Nigeria and al-Shabaab in Somalia. Governments also play a repressive role in many countries, including Burma, China, Russia, Pakistan, and Vietnam. These violations often lead to instability and violence, thereby underscoring the importance of the U.S. using all the tools at its disposal, including IRFA. With growing violent religious extremism and continuing authoritarianism, the United States needs to energize and mainstream the promotion of religion or belief. The executive branch should reinvigorate its commitment to religious freedom by, number one, ensuring that high-level officials speak publicly about the importance of religious freedom and include concerns across U.S. engagements with countries, including in economic, political, and security discussions, to achieve a whole-of-government effort. We should mandate increased training for diplomats on the importance of religious freedom and expanding U.S. government programming on religious freedom work on the ground. We should work in coalition with other nations to advance religious freedom, such as the contact group of governments focusing on international religious freedom that has recently been initiated by the Canadians. We need to annually designate countries of particular concern, and that's a term of art within the legislation, for particularly severe violations of religious freedom. And if administrations do not do this, Congress legislatively should require annual designations. We should ensure that countries of particular concern, or the CPC list, expands and contracts as conditions warrant, so glaring omissions like Pakistan and Vietnam can be correctly designated. Congress has an important role to play in promoting religious freedom by amending IRFA, our authorizing legislation, to expand the CPC classification to allow us to designate countries where particularly severe religious freedom violations are occurring, but a government doesn't exist or control its territory, such as in the Central African Republic, and amending IRFA to allow non-state actors also to be designated, those who perpetrate particularly severe religious freedom violations, such as ISIL, which in the case of ISIL, they claim to be a state, and yet under the terms of our statute, we really wouldn't be able to address them directly. We would like to see Congress sponsor legislation that promotes freedom of religion or belief to give our government the tools and resources it needs and signals to foreign governments the importance of religious freedom in bilateral relations. We would love to see Congress hold more hearings such as this one in support of religious freedom to reinforce that our government must actively promote this freedom. Congress is uniquely situated to raise concerns about religious freedom during delegation trips abroad and supporting those advocating for change by meeting with civil society and prisoners. And finally, we would like to encourage members of Congress to participate in the Defending Freedoms Project, an effort of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, USCIRF, and Amnesty, through which members of Congress individually advocate for prisoners of conscience. We face an enormously challenging landscape abroad for freedom of religion and belief. We can see constructive change by making religious freedom a central component of U.S. foreign policy, improving our use of existing tools, and creating new ones for a rapidly changing environment. Never have the stakes been higher. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Farr.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to this important hearing. Let me begin by giving credit where credit is due in the State Department. There are in the Department officials who care deeply about religious freedom and who have worked hard to improve U.S. policy. In my prepared testimony, I give some examples of their work. Unfortunately, that work is marginalized within the Department. Their efforts are ad hoc. None is part of an integrated strategy to advance religious freedom. Indeed, such a strategy has not existed for the almost 6 years of this President's tenure, and it does not exist today. As a consequence, the United States has had virtually no impact on the global rise of religious persecution. We have also missed important opportunities to employ religious freedom policy as a means of undermining the development of violent religious extremism, encouraging economic growth, and helping struggling democracies to stabilize. The evidence for this stark assessment is compelling. I cannot, like the Chairman, identify a single country in the world where the United States, under this administration, has advanced religious freedom or reduced religious persecution. I believe the President's nominee for the position of Ambassador at Large, Rabbi David Saperstein, should be confirmed immediately. But when he steps into the job, the post of Ambassador at Large will have been vacant for almost a year since the departure of the previous incumbent, and vacant for over half the tenure of this President. Compare the administration's treatment of this position with another similar job, that of Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues. Someone has been in that position for virtually the entire tenure of this administration. Why? Because women's issues are a priority, as they should be. It's difficult to conclude that the Religious Freedom Ambassador or the issue he represents are perceived as important at the State Department. It's no surprise, then, that the Ambassador for Women's Issues reports directly to the Secretary of State, but the Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom reports to a much lower level official, many levels removed from the Secretary. You can be sure that this marginalization of the Ambassador in U.S. policy is not lost on America's diplomats, nor is it lost on foreign governments and those who persecute on the basis of religion. Internationally, the status of religious freedom continues to decline. Increasing numbers of human beings are subjected to violent religious persecution, either because of their religious beliefs and practices, or, as in the case in the recent barbaric and cruel beheadings of British and American citizens, because of the religious beliefs and practices of their tormentors. As I see it, Mr. Chairman, there are two powerful reasons for a comprehensive American strategy to advance religious freedom. The first is a moral imperative. Last year at a conference in Rome, Iraqi Patriarch Louis Raphael Sacco, a man now in the eye of the storm, said something that still haunts me. "If they kill us all," he said, "will you do something then?" I believe we have a responsibility to that man and his flock and to the others of Iraq and Syria and elsewhere who are fending for their lives. But Patriarch Sacco said something else that day. The title of his speech was, "What happens to the Middle East if Christians flee?" The answer was twofold: terrible suffering for the Christians, but also increased instability and harm to the societies themselves. Here lies the second reason for a comprehensive U.S. strategy. Religious freedom isn't simply a right not to be tortured or killed, or the freedom to worship privately. It's a fundamental human right that has distinct and inevitable public dimensions. It's necessary not only for individual human flourishing, but for the success of any state, especially highly religious nations like those of the Middle East. Ample research has shown what common sense suggests. Democracies can't consolidate without religious freedom. Economies can't develop without religious freedom. And religious freedom can be a counter to violent religious extremism. For all these reasons, I call upon the President of the United States to issue a presidential policy directive on international religious freedom and American national security. This directive would mandate a coordinated U.S. religious freedom strategy. It would direct the involvement of all U.S. foreign policy agencies under the leadership of the Ambassador at Large. It would direct mandatory training for American diplomats and other officials involved in carrying out the new strategy. I would note one additional rationale for involving religious freedom in our national security: blood and treasure. The successful surge of 2007 in Iraq created an opportunity to convince the majority Shiite community that if they failed to integrate Sunnis and other minorities into the political system, the new Iraqi state would fail. In short, they needed to move toward religious freedom if they were to succeed as a state that would be stable and free of religious violence and conflict as it has today. We didn't do that, and the consequences have been catastrophic. Today, ISIS poses a serious threat to the United States. Military action is now necessary to defeat ISIS, but integrating religious freedom into our future strategy can undermine the institutions and habits that give rise to Islamist terrorism and reduce the need for future military action. At a fraction of the cost and without loss of blood on the part of anyone, a diplomatic counterterrorism offensive could increase American national security. Let me end by quoting from Rabbi Saperstein's testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He said, "I will seek to engage every segment of the State Department and the rest of the U.S. government to integrate religious freedom into our nation's statecraft, counterterrorism, conflict stability efforts, economic development, and human rights." Precisely so. The Senate should confirm him immediately. Saperstein is a talented man, but he will not succeed if the President, the Secretary of State, and the Congress don't give him the tools to succeed. I end my testimony, Mr. Chairman, with 5 suggestions for this committee and the Congress to amend the International Religious Freedom Act, which will help our religious freedom policy to succeed.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. It's wonderful to be with you today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss international religious freedom, and my aim is to discuss the ways that the U.S. can improve its religious freedom policy to make a meaningful difference in improving international religious freedom. I ask that my written testimony be submitted to the record. At the outset, let me indicate that I am conscious that this year's hearing builds on testimony received by this subcommittee at a similar hearing last year. That testimony established that religious freedom throughout the world is getting worse, not better. And unfortunately, initiatives under the International Religious Freedom Act, or IRFA, are not doing as much as could be done to reverse that trend. Dr. Farr and the Chairman have both indicated today that they could not identify a single country whose religious freedom has improved as a result of U.S. religious freedom policy. That must change. My written testimony endorses 9 concrete recommendations that were made last year, some of which have been repeated today. I've noted in my written testimony that in each case the Act currently permits the suggested changes. My first recommendation is to urge this subcommittee to act on those recommendations from last year. My major additional recommendations focus on urging much greater emphasis on those aspects of IRFA that contemplate identifying and incentivizing better religious compliance through the use of positive measures authorized by the Act. The first policy goal of the Act is condemnation. The Act specifically says that it shall be the policy goal of the United States to condemn violations of religious freedom. This policy goal undergirds the annual reporting requirements and the sanction regime that the Act establishes. While it is no doubt important to retain those aspects of IRFA that hold egregious violators to account, this purpose has inevitably caused tension and concern in shaping U.S. foreign policy. The practical result has been that under both Republican and Democratic administrations, the State Department has failed to designate countries of particular concern, or CPCs, annually, and then to impose sanctions as required by the Act. In fact, the State Department has designated CPCs in only 3 of the last 7 years, with 2014 still pending. In fact, the subcommittee has also heard that discrete sanctions under the Act have only been imposed on a single country in its entire 16-year history. All other sanctions have simply been double-counted or waived. But with limited CPC designations and almost no actual motivating sanctions, is it any wonder that U.S. policy has had insufficient impact on the worldwide international religious freedom? What I suggest is that the problem may not be entirely with State, but with the overemphasis on the condemnation goal in IRFA and the sanction regime it implements. In my view, IRFA should place much greater emphasis on identifying opportunities for making a meaningful difference. This can be done by first identifying the countries most open to religious freedom improvements, and second, by encouraging incentives and assistance to improve religious freedom. While sanctions are an important backstop for the worst offenders of religious freedom, this isn't where many of the real opportunities lie. In addition to focus on countries of particular concern, we need to focus on countries of particular opportunity, as my colleague Cole Durham calls them. We need to do a much better job of identifying the latter so we can help them find ways to make concrete and significant progress in implementing religious freedom ideals. Fortunately, the annual effort to produce country reports on religious freedom provides an excellent vehicle for identifying countries of particular opportunity. Additionally, IRFA already contains authorization for providing positive incentives to encourage other countries to improve religious freedom. The Act already authorizes State to pursue numerous positive incentives. These are described in greater detail in my full statement. Briefly, the State Department should, 1, recognize and reward countries making important religious freedom progress, 2, recognize meritorious or distinguished religious freedom service by State employees through performance pay and awards, 3, link humanitarian, military, and other U.S. aid to religious freedom progress, 4, link U.S. economic incentives to religious freedom progress, and 5, conduct country-specific consultations to tailor goals and incentives for different countries. Since authorization for these positive incentives already exists under IRFA, my strong recommendation is that Congress use its oversight authority to investigate the extent to which these positive incentives have already been used by State and to encourage State to implement them in the future. There is no doubt that many positive steps are being taken, but I would recommend that the State Department be urged to formulate a strategic plan for more systematic use of such positive measures. Ideas from some of the embassies which have developed the most effective positive measures should be shared systematically with other embassies around the world. In summary, instead of emphasizing name and shame tactics, IRFA should be reoriented to identify and incentivize improved performance through greater utilization of positive measures. I believe that this positive approach will reinvigorate U.S. policy on religious freedom and will help IRFA become a much more powerful force to help improve the lives of millions of persons who deeply desire religious freedom. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ogbe, how do we pronounce your last name?
Yes, it worked the last time.
Yes. But if you can turn on your microphone, that would be great.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, thank you very much for allowing me to testify today. This hearing is a very timely hearing. As you may have heard in the news, just yesterday, Boko Haram bombed a school and killed 15 people who were preparing to be teachers. Let me start with 3 sobering statistics. The first is that Christians are the most persecuted religion in the world today. The second is that more Christians have been killed this century than in previous centuries. And the third is that more Christians were killed in northern Nigeria in the year 2012 than the rest of the world combined. Now, one of the things that Boko Haram has done was this time last year, they used chainsaws to decapitate over 150 Christians when they mounted a fake roadblock on a highway. These are the kinds of atrocities that this group has engaged in even before they abducted 300 young girls from a boarding school in April. With regard to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, it is my thinking that they missed a golden opportunity to alert the world to the atrocities and the religious genocide that Boko Haram was conducting. And what happened was that the USIF, in its annual report on Nigeria last year, did not make a recommendation to the State Department for Boko Haram to be designated as a foreign terrorist organization. This, I think, would have been the moment that USIF would have lent its voice to a critical policy recognition of what this terrorist group was doing. I also want to mention the response of the State Department. The F ambassador at the time traveled to 27 countries in her 29 months in office. And at the time when you had this horrendous anti-Christian genocide going on in Nigeria, she did not meet with Christian leaders in that country. And I say this to say that we have a good law, but if we have people aggressively implementing existing powers that they have, that there's some of these issues that would not need to be reformed. There are obviously clear issues that warrant reform, but the existing powers are being underutilized. I want to point out that the State Department has continued to downplay the persecution of Christians in northern Nigeria, and this is a grave concern for us. There is nothing that ISIS has done in Iraq in the last 2 months that they have not done in northern Nigeria in the last 3 years. Now, let me say that we're all shocked by what ISIS has done in beheading 2 American journalists. But Boko Haram has tried to do that several times. And just last week, we heard for the first time the name of an American that Boko Haram attempted to kill. Her name is Venice Guthrie. Until this day, the State Department has not publicly admitted that Americans have been targeted by this horrific terror group. I think I want to quickly make the linkage here that groups that terrorize people of other faiths in that country will ultimately want to set their sights on bigger targets. And that's why we see what is going on now, is that groups like ISIL and Boko Haram want to reach America and want to kill Americans. Let me point out that one of the concerns we've had with U.S. response is the effort to downplay the intent of these groups. It's what I call the see no jihad, hear no jihad, say no jihad strategy. And we heard in Iraq as in Nigeria, oh, what you need to do is create a more inclusive government. Violent jihadist groups are not about inclusive governments, they are about exclusive governments. They want to rule exclusively by themselves. I want to take a moment to say that I honestly believe that we need to fund USAID better. I believe that USAID needs to use its powers more effectively. I want to submit my testimony for the record, but before I hand over, I do want to pay tribute to a young girl who was killed by Boko Haram. I conducted a 1-month investigation after we found out that Boko Haram has started using females as suicide bombers. And it was my sad duty this week to notify members of the Chibok community that Boko Haram, that abducted about 300 Christian schoolgirls from their school in northern Nigeria, has used one of them and blew her up in a school and killed several people. As a tribute to this girl, I want to mention the words of a song that she is known for by people in her class. And what she said was, "We have come to the end of the world now. We have to stand firm and be strong in the Lord because we are now in a bad situation. And there's milk and honey in the place where I'm going. No matter the condition, I will not go back. The Lord is my refuge. We are now in a bad situation. We better turn to God now to enjoy Him on the last day." And Boko Haram strapped this girl with explosives. We do not know if she was aware what was on her body, but she was blown up and killed in northern Nigeria a few weeks ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stanky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Tierney, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to discuss this important issue, international religious freedom. Religious freedom is a cornerstone of secure and thriving societies. Denying religious freedom is associated with instability, rights abuses, and violent extremism. The rising tide of violence and religious intolerance and restrictions on religious freedom is clearly an ongoing threat to U.S. national security. The recent events in Iraq, Syria, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Egypt all underscore the urgency of formulating U.S. national security policies that promote and protect religious freedom and related human rights as part of the strategy to secure U.S. national interests. In the last year, there's been an alarming rise in deadly violence targeting religious communities. ISIS and Boko Haram seizing and holding territory, committing horrendous human rights abuses. It's also very troubling how effective these groups have been in using mass and social media to get out their message and to recruit followers. Burma, Pakistan, Egypt, all places where we continue to see way too much in the way of violence targeting religious minorities. Not at the same scale of violence, but Also troubling is growing anti-Semitic and other hate violence in Europe, as neo-fascist, anti-Semitic political parties have gained electoral strength throughout the region, particularly in Hungary and in Greece. My written testimony covers these situations. Let me make 3 general points. First, although non-state actors perpetrate much of the violence, failures of governments play an enormous role. Governments often create or fail to confront the conditions that give rise to violence. There's a direct link between ISIS success and the Iraqi government failures on good governance and addressing the grievances of the Sunni population. Second, many of the situations we're discussing have deteriorated because of the failure of governments to adequately protect human rights and the rule of law and more effectively confront discrimination and hatred. Support for ISIS and Boko Haram has been fueled by human rights violations by the Iraqi and Nigerian security services and their paramilitary supporters. These aren't rogue violations, but seemingly deliberate, abusive, and counterproductive counterterrorism and security policies. Third, the United States has invested a tremendous amount of money, prestige, and in some cases blood in the success of these countries to become more stable, to move in a more democratic direction, more tied to the rule of law. So the need is pressing, and what needs to be done? First of all, as several of us have said, the Senate should confirm Rabbi Saperstein to be the ambassador at large. It's the immediate step that should be taken. I urge you to urge your colleagues in the Senate to do so. Second, the United States needs country-specific strategies to better integrate the promotion of religious freedom and other human rights into its effort to confront each of these national security challenges. Developing and investing in these strategies is a way to prevent security situations in countries that could eventually deteriorate to the point where we would even contemplate U.S. military action. The elements of this type of strategy include promoting a more rights-respecting approach by foreign governments to counterterrorism, stopping U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and Qatar from funding religious extremism beyond their borders. Where there's political will, provide assistance to help countries better integrate the security services with members of religious minorities and promote better law enforcement response to violence. Impunity for any act of religiously motivated violence is a cancer that can spread out of control. Countering extremist propaganda and hatred, and also assisting IDPs, refugees, and asylum seekers fleeing religious persecution. Now, in order to implement these strategies, the White House and the State Department needs to better integrate the ambassador at large into the work of national security, conflict prevention, counterterrorism, countering violent extremism, and democracy promotion. Dr. Farr and I saw the same line in Rabbi Saperstein's testimony, and I'll highlight that too. It's extremely important. But how do you do that? And let me end with a couple of specific recommendations. There's a new national security strategy in the works, and it should include a clear statement that it's U.S. policy to advance international religious freedom and related human rights as part of the strategy to promote stability in foreign countries and combat terrorism. Second, the President should create a permanent interagency policy committee on religion, human rights, and national security, co-chaired by a Deputy National Security Advisor and the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Give it resources, give it a mandate to coordinate policies across the agencies, as I think we've all been discussing. Regardless of where the IRF ambassador sits in the bureaucracy, the Secretary of State should ensure that the ambassador has regular and consistent access to him, to senior State Department level meetings, and fully integrated into the broader policy discussions. Finally, Under Secretary Sewell, who I know is going to talk later, should create within her purview a unit that could be deployed to the field to assess the risk of systemic violence targeting religious communities and respond, make recommendations and respond using the tools that she has within her shop. And finally, the President should send Vice President Biden to represent the United States at the upcoming high-level OSCE Berlin Conference on Anti-Semitism, and I'm hoping that Congress also will send a high-level delegation to that important meeting. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank all of you for all your testimony. Your fuller remarks, if there are some, obviously will be entered into the record. I would also just ask that if you have very specific recommendations or want to modify those at any time, please send those forward as we digest. We're not only the Oversight Committee, we're supposed to be a Government Reform Committee, and certainly there are things that the law can do to help catch up with what we're supposed to do. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from South Carolina who cares passionately about these issues, Mr. Gowdy.
I want to thank the chairman, and I want to thank all the panelists. I want to just single out the one that I know the best, Dr. Farr, who has done a lot, Chairman Chaffetz, to help me understand the issues, and our mutual friend, John Hutchinson from South Carolina. Dr. Farr, I just have one question, and then I want to yield my time to the gentleman from Utah who has worked so assiduously on this issue. You mentioned the Senate's heretofore failure to confirm the ambassador at large. Among the mysteries of the world, the Senate confirmation process probably ranks in the top 3, at least to me. So I don't know what the holdup would be. Is there one of your panelists mentioned our colleagues in the Senate and perhaps putting pressure on them, which traditionally does not work. What can we do? Is there a holdup that's been identified, or is it just the normal Senate schedule? And I'll let you answer that, and then Mr. Chaffetz, I would give the rest of my time to you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Gowdy. Others on the panel may know better than I, but I understand that the committee was to vote on his nomination today. It may be happening as we speak. The problem is that the Senate is going to be in recess. So if there's a way for the Senate to, which I know you have no control over, to confirm him before they go in recess, before the Congress does, it would be good because he could get into the job. But I do think at this point it's a procedural matter rather than any opposition.
I think the gentleman from South Carolina, if you were going to take this job on, you've all offered recommendations, things you can do, but what realistically can that position actually do, given its status, given its placement? I know there's some recommendations on the elevation and who they report to, different committees that we can, but if you had an objective for this person in the first 100 days, the first 3, what would that be? What would be on that person's list? What can they realistically actually do and accomplish? And again, I think you all know this. You've all stated it. We just haven't seen the numbers and the meter move in the right direction. In fact, it's going in the wrong direction. Yes.
Well, I'll be happy to take a crack at that. I think to some degree there needs to be an effort to change the culture at the State Department. For many years there was something that was known almost as, I think it was called the secularization thesis, that as societies became more modern, they would inevitably become more secular, and that religion was not really a terribly relevant factor, or would not continue to be a terribly relevant factor in the lives of large numbers of people around the world. And if anything, the history of the last 25 years has undermined that now somewhat discredited secularization thesis. And I do think that Rabbi Saperstein will face a challenge of sort of confronting a culture at the State Department that has tended to sideline these concerns, has tended to view the business of state as being, of course, maintaining to the extent possible positive relations between the United States and other countries, and when there are problems, working at other levels and on other areas of focus. And so I think it is critically important that the next ambassador at large find a way to have that direct access to the Secretary and indeed to the President. You know, the terms of the statute say that the ambassador at large is the principal advisor to the President and Secretary of State on matters relating to international religious freedom. We no longer need to make the case. The world is in flames. It is on fire with religious freedom atrocities, and those atrocities have direct and terrifying implications for our national security. So I would say try not to be co-opted by the highly bureaucratic nature of the State Department. battle hard for that ability to, in fact, fulfill the statutory claim to be that principal advisor. And finally, I would say, and I don't underestimate the value of this, and I happened to be with Rabbi Saperstein yesterday at a powerful, wonderful event remembering and honoring Anne Frank, the remarkable young woman who died in the Holocaust, the Dutch woman. He spoke so powerfully, so eloquently, in such an inspiring fashion. And I do think that we should not underestimate the power and the ability of someone of great passion, great commitment, and great dedication to this issue to change the narrative and to draw more focus to it.
Thank you. And my guess is you all have input on this. We can either come back to that or, again, submit it to the committee. We have a second panel, and we're going to also have a second series of votes. So we've got to try to balance that time. And I thank the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the central tools of the International Religious Freedom Act is the designation of countries of particular concern, or CPCs, who are particularly severe violators of religious freedom. However, the CPC mechanism has not always been consistently used consistently, and I understand that the State Department has interpreted this statute to not require annual designations. For example, the Bush administration did not make any CPC designation after 2006, and the current administration has only made 2 designations so far. Dr. Lantos Swett, is that correct?
Yes, and if you're going where I think you're going, we very much would encourage them to make annual CPC designations as contemplated in the statute.
That's where I was going, and can you tell me why?
Well, we don't want the CPC list to be a frozen sort of dead document that just sits on a shelf. The process of evaluating on an annual basis whether a country is progressing in the right direction, is regressing, is in and of itself, it brings pressure to bear on those countries. When they know that that process is dynamic, it also gives you a much more dynamic opportunity to recognize when progress has been made. The worst thing that can happen is to create a list, stick it on a shelf, and nobody thinks about it for 4 or 5 years. We want state thinking about religious freedom because it really matters to our national security and our foreign policy. So it's the dynamism and the annual process that brings attention to bear on the good guys and those making progress.
Now, the other issue seems to be disagreement on what countries should be designated between, with the International Religious Freedom Act, the State Department, and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. How does the Commission determine which countries are engaged in particularly severe violations?
Well, it's a very detailed process involving a lot of research drawing on information, testimony, and information that we get from a wide variety of sources. Of course, to some degree, we rely on our significant State Department interlocutors in the various countries, religious communities, NGOs, outside organizations that do evaluations. We take trips to those countries to make our own independent assessments. I hope I'm not going to sound too self-congratulatory, but I would say that the USERF CPC list is the gold standard. And I recognize we have the luxury of not having to consider the full range of concerns that our State Department has to deal with. So, I think we need to cut them a little slack. They have to balance things. We don't at USERF. We have one focus, which is international religious freedom. But for that reason, I do think our list is the gold standard. I think if a country makes it onto our recommended list, it has met the statutory requirements. And sometimes state can't find their way to getting where we get to. But I would commend that people consider the USERF list to be a very, very good list.
What reasons have they given not to go along with your recommendation?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't want to put words into anybody's mouth, and so I want to be very circumspect in answering that. Certainly their formal responses would indicate that they're not sure that the that the bar has been crossed in a statutory sense. But I would give as an example Pakistan, which is a country that I think most people, looking at the statutory language, looking at the reality of over 100 people in prison, many of them on death row for violations of outrageous blasphemy codes. Look at the persecution of the Ahmadiyya Muslims in Pakistan. Look at the threats and the murder of people like Shahbaz Bhatti, the only Christian member of the Pakistani government before he was murdered, and others, would say this is a country that has severe religious freedom abuses going on and either perpetrated or tolerated, or a situation of impunity by the government. Tom, I know you have something to add there.
Well, no, sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt this.
No, no.
I didn't want to say something about the CPC. I wanted to just say a word about the issue of how the ambassador could be effective, if I might. I'll be very brief. My first recommendation to the committee, which was the first recommendation last year, is that the IRFA be amended to require the ambassador at large to report to the Secretary of State, just as the ambassador at large for others, such as women's issues, do. You could put the Pope in this position, Mr. Chairman, and buried in the bureaucracy as he is, he would not be effective. It's because the State Department understands this issue as a junior position. Foreign governments, it's not rocket science, understand it's not a priority. The Congress could make this happen. The State Department is not going to do it. They're not going to do it with hopefully Ambassador Saperstein.
Can I just ask one more? How effective have the CPC designations and resulting actions been in actually changing the behavior of the offending countries?
Well, I don't think I can be quite as self-congratulatory in response to that question. Part of the reason is, as has been mentioned by a number of us here on the panel, none of the administrations since the creation of IRFA have adequately utilized the tools that are at their disposal. When sanctions are imposed pursuant to a CPC designation, they're always what we call double-hatted. So there's no specific penalty associated to the designation as a CPC. Mr. Smith suggested that we also need to look for countries of particular opportunity. I think that's a great idea. I think there needs to be, I'm a believer in shame and blame. Look, I'm a Jewish mother, daughter of Holocaust survivors, so we believe in the power of guilt. We really do. And it's a highly sophisticated art within that tradition, if I may say so, with a tongue firmly in cheek. But so I do believe in shame and blame, but I don't think it's enough by itself. So I think we need to look for positive opportunities. But I would say this, when it comes to the ineffectiveness of change as a result of CPC designations, there is a role for sanctions. And if I can quote the great Catholic writer G.K. Chesterton, I think he once said, speaking of Christianity, that it's not that it's been tried and found wanting, but it's been found hard and not tried. And I think that that also sort of has some relevance to whether or not we could bring about more change if we had more robust and particular sanctions associated with CPC designations.
Thank you. Thank you for the time.
I think Mr. Stanky wanted to add something briefly, if we could, please.
Yes, very briefly. I think it's hard to point to success stemming from CPC designation or actions they're taken. I would suggest take a different approach, right? The administration is engaged on ISIS, on Boko Haram, on Burma. These countries are ones where Rabbi Saperstein, as ambassador at large, could be put at the table of the serious policy discussions. He could go there, and he could come back and lay out a strategy for how to reverse the conditions that are plaguing and producing these abuses. And I think that's something that's achievable in a short term where there's already action taking place. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're way over the time. Let me go to Mr. Bentivoglio. We'll have a chance to come back here. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bentivoglio, is now recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for coming here today on this very important issue. America is waking up to the atrocities in the Middle East. I've spoken 13 times on the floor of Congress about religious freedom issues in the Middle East, as well as China and other places of the world. And my office has been reviewing some of the standards I think the State Department has for how they rate countries as far as the religious freedom. Are you familiar with that? And I think you talked about that earlier. Can you explain that in more detail? Anybody want to answer that question? What that rating system is all about in the State Department? How they rate countries based on religious freedoms?
I don't think they do that, sir. I think what they do is name the bad guys. That's the countries of particular concern list.
Okay, so there's really no
there's no ranking,
no matrix to use for how we, countries that are promoting religious freedom versus not promoting, or the opposite.
There is the Pew Research Center produces an annual report that does, in effect, rank these countries and gives them scores.
And the reason I'm asking this is because in order to promote religious freedom, sometimes we ignore those atrocities taking place, and yet the United States government will still write them a foreign aid check for some reason or another, usually in the form of tanks and airplanes and AK-47s or similar. So how do you feel about rating these countries based on their matrix of religious freedom and foreign aid? I noticed, Mr. Smith, you have a list of, excuse me, as specified in the Act, negative sanctions include, but I don't see foreign, not getting a check from the United States government. Do you think that would have an effect if?
Yes, of course it would. And in fact, I'm not sure if that was totally understood. My testimony is that it should be linked, that there should be a linkage between U.S. aid, military aid, and religious freedom, which is already recommended in the Act.
In the Act?
Yes.
But we're not enforcing it.
That's correct.
That's what you're telling me.
That's exactly right. And if I could just say, while the focus should be on countries of particular concern because of the horrendous religious freedom records that they have, most countries are not CPCs. And so my testimony is that we should also focus on those countries that are not the worst offenders, because those are the ones that legitimately want to improve their records and are most susceptible to incentives and to persuasion. When we think of the CPC countries, we're really talking about criminal activity and other forms of abuse, and they're not very responsive. And that's why there's a problem. And if the goal of IRFA is to actually make a difference, we need to also focus on those countries most susceptible to positive incentives and persuasion.
Very good. So how do you think we should handle the present problem we have in the Middle East with the persecution of Christians, Coptics, and other minority religions?
Well, that's obviously a tremendous tragedy, and there's been a lot of discussion over the past couple of years about how it's increasing. What needs to be done, in my view, is there needs to be a strategy that's put into place by State. And it's not a matter of simply giving some speeches or even writing an effective report that explains the problem. There needs to be a strategy for success, and that includes the type of efforts that will be made, the linking of U.S. aid, U.S. incentives of various kinds. Economic incentives can be linked to religious freedom, and identifying the people who are in charge of religious policy in those countries, getting to know them and trying to work with them.
Do you think there's any hope in restoring the homes in the communities that the Christians were forced to leave after living there for thousands of years? Do you think there's any chance of them ever going back with the present state of affairs?
Well, we have to always hope that that can be the case.
Hope.
And it may take time, but quick action is needed now to prevent further erosion.
What do you mean by quick action? Can you be more detailed?
Well, the strategy that I'm referring to.
Okay, strategy.
Yes.
But you're not really outlining a specific strategy. And I don't mean to, attack you on this, because there's a lot of people here in Washington that use that word strategy, but I haven't seen the details of that strategy. Do you want to add something? Excuse me. Thank you very much, Mr. Smith.
You bet.
Appreciate it.
Just very specifically to your question about whether or not these persecuted communities that have fled could be resettled. We have had a number of briefings at USCIRF from representatives of those communities, and I can convey to you that what they said to us is, we cannot go back. After what happened to us, after the way we saw our neighbors going back generation upon generation either turn against us or fail to defend us in any meaningful way, we cannot rebuild our lives there, which is why I think one thing we need to be prepared to do as a government is raise the refugee resettlement quotas for some of these horribly targeted communities in the region of, Iraq, in particular, the area that ISIL has taken over in Iraq. So members of the communities are not feeling optimistic about the idea of their lives resuming there.
Just one more quick question.
We have a second panel, and we have the votes
Thank you
that are
very
going to
much.
come up. I thank the gentleman. We'll now recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I'd like to welcome all of the panelists, and particularly my good friend Dr. Lantos Swett, whom I first met as the daughter of my former colleague and the wife of my former colleague, and a great candidate herself. So it's good to see you still working hard on issues, and wonderful to see you again. The International Religious Freedom Act is the main legislative vehicle through which Congress has authorized the administration to respond to gross violations of religious freedom. But in light of the sharp rise of religious persecution, we should stop and ask how well the Act is equipped to deal with crises around the world and what changes Congress can make to do it better. And I'd like Dr. Lantos Swett to answer that and elaborate on what you actually wrote about in your testimony and in your conclusion that IRFA's tools are, quote, almost irrelevant in situations like Syria. I would like to add that I went to the grave of Thomas Jefferson, and if I recall, on his headstone is not author of the Declaration of Independence, not president, not this or that, but what he chose to put on his headstone was the author of the Religious Freedom Act, a basic belief in our country. And I really am very disturbed to see the persecution of religion around the world that we've seen, particularly recently against Christians. So I look forward to hearing your statement, Dr. Swett, Lantos Swett.
Thank you so much. We have made a number of recommendations, but I do think probably the single most significant thing that could be done to make IRFA a more effective piece of legislation, make USCIRF and the IRF office in the State Department more effective, would in fact be for our government at the highest levels to prioritize this cause. And I will say that I do see a shifting attitude. I think it is becoming increasingly apparent to people at the highest levels of our government that if we don't get this piece right, we will not be able to solve our most intractable foreign policy and security challenges. If you overlay the list of countries of particular concern with the list of countries of particular national security threat to the United States, it's shocking how closely those two lists mesh for the most part. One thing that I think is already contemplated in IRFA that has not happened, and I think another member of the panel referred to this, is it calls for example, a director-level position at the National Security Council who could serve as the special advisor on the National Security Council on religious freedom issues. I think my most passionate argument would be that people need to stop thinking about religious freedom as a nice idea, something that reflects our values, something that it would make us feel good if people could, sort of practice their beliefs more freely in other parts of the world. When you have societies that repress, oppress, persecute on the basis of sectarianism and religion, you create the seedbed for extremism, for violence, for instability, and ultimately for the export of terrorism. We really have got to get this right, and I'm so glad you brought that up about Jefferson, because I think that was our secret sauce as a country. That was the piece we got right that was revolutionary at the time. Unheard of in human history, this notion that the government shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion nor denying the free exercise thereof. This brilliant, simple formulation protecting the right of freedom of religion and separating it from being intertwined with government. That's the basic deal right there, and it made all the difference in the way we developed as a nation. So we need higher level engagement. We need this to become a priority at the State Department, on the part of the administration, and in the Congress. IRFA, there are things we can change there, but there's no magic bullet there. The magic bullet lies in raising its priority.
But that's a hard thing to do. You have to almost put it into the structure, and I will join you and others in writing a letter to the State Department or the President that this position on the Security Council should be filled.
That would be
But what other things can we do to institutionalize? It's one thing to say, oh, raise the priority, but we know what government's like. You're under tremendous pressures, usually understaffed, and so you go to what you have to do. So you almost have to put a structure in place. What about special envoys? We use that all the time in international affairs. Maybe special envoys to special regions on particular problems as we see it. If anybody would like to.
I'm actually going to defer to Dr. Farr, who I've often referred to as sort of my tutor on religious freedom and really very knowledgeable.
My time is up now, so I request the Chairman to let him respond.
Very briefly, two things. We don't need a special envoy. We have an ambassador at large. Nobody's in the position. Get it filled and make this position report to the Secretary of State like other ambassadors at large. Secondly, I recommend in my testimony a presidential policy directive on religious freedom and national security. The reality is we have nothing in our religious freedom policy to respond to what's going on in the Middle East now. Nothing except speeches, words, and reports in response to your question. We need a strategy that has action as part of it. But here I'm not talking about just talking about strategies. A presidential directive to develop a strategy on religious freedom and national security. That will put us in a position to do something.
Thank you. I'm now going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to go to Mr. Ogbe, who I really want to talk about what's going on in Nigeria and Boko Haram. There was a lot of criticism for Secretary Clinton, for the State Department as a whole, for not designating them as a foreign terrorist organization. In your perspective, why did that take so long? But then once it was designated, what changed? Did it actually even make a difference or move the meter, and is it getting better or worse, or is it just the same?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Now, we, to this day, do not understand why the State Department dragged its feet with the FTO designation. We do know that there were individuals, like 20 professors, that wrote to the State Department and said, don't do it. We did write to them and provide briefs and facts showing why this should be done. One of the really difficult aspects for us was the fact that the State Department would not admit that Americans had been attacked by Boko Haram. Ultimately, they did the designation, but we do not know if they have had the political will to implement the sanctions required. We don't know if they just did it to just wish us away. I can give a practical illustration of some of the things that have emerged, which an FTO designation implementation would have showed. For example, there are reports that Turkish Airlines has been flying arms into Nigeria surreptitiously. Now, if we were aggressively tracking the flow of arms and finances, that is an organization that by now the State Department should have imposed sanctions on. So we do feel that the situation has worsened. Just this week, one Catholic diocese is reporting they've lost 2,500 members. That's one church losing the equivalent of 9/11, one diocese. So the situation is getting much worse, and we're now thinking there needs to be a look at the Leahy Amendment to see how military assistance can be provided, because Nigeria is a country that's too big to fail, to use those terms.
So to be clear, what would you have the United States do from your perspective? What would you want them to do?
Well, one of the first things would be to stop the denial. It's hard to believe that till this day, administration officials continue to deny the serious killings of Christians that's going on. But I honestly think that if there is military assistance, last week a top U.S. official said, we need to end the denial and the pride. Nigeria is losing territory to these people. If she's genuine in her comments, then we need to look at military assistance so that these people can be stopped. They've taken over 6 cities in the last couple of weeks, and that is not a good sign for the entire sub-region. So we do need to look at military assistance. If the ambassador is appointed, that's one of the things that ambassador can hit the ground running. He can intervene, he can engage with the Nigerian government, with the refugee situation in Cameroon, and so on and so forth.
I thank you. Unless there's some other pressing questions, what I would like to do is thank this panel for their participation. I would have preferred to have just one panel, quite frankly, but we do have the person from the State Department. We'd like her to have time to testify. We would invite you to stay here and listen if you would like, but if it's okay with the committee, unless there's an objection, the committee is going to stand in recess for just a couple of minutes while we change the panel there. And we thank you so much for your dedication and commitment to this issue and your passion. And it is a very important issue, and we look forward to the continued dialogue with you. We'll stand in recess for just a few minutes.